Thursday, January 16th, 2025, the City of Atlanta Department of Public Works killed a man sleeping in a tent off Auburn Avenue. Witnesses say the crew announced their arrival but didn't do a full sweep of the tents to make sure everyone was awake and out. This happened just a block away from Ebenezer Baptist Church and the tomb of Martin Luther King Jr. Housing was a big issue for Dr. King, and he spent a good deal of his time and effort organizing in the 60s on fighting for better housing conditions and access to housing. Unfortunately, his biggest win on housing wouldn't come until after his murder. The Fair Housing Act was a key piece of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which was passed days after Dr. King was killed in Memphis, Tennessee, and a wave of uprisings shook the country to its foundation. Dr. King's work on housing was mostly focused on things like slums, poor quality of housing, and the segregationist policies that forced black folks into some of the worst housing in the country, including up north in places like Chicago. He didn't have a ton to say about homelessness because it wasn't nearly as bad of a problem then as it is now, as we still struggle to recover from the effects of the 2008 housing crisis. Home prices have soared since the crash bottomed out in the early 2010s, but for most people, that's proving to be an issue. Home ownership is declining, people are moving out of their parents' houses later and later, the number of people living in any given house or apartment is rising, and as of the end of 2024, the US is experiencing record homelessness. I think it's pretty safe to say that Martin Luther King Jr. would think that the inequality in housing, the predatory mentality of landlords, the unchecked rise of homelessness, and the inaction of government in spite of the face of all of this was pretty intolerable. For the city of Atlanta to do a sweep of a place where homeless people were sleeping so close to his spiritual home and resting place on the weekend of his birthday to wind up murdering someone in the process is almost too on the nose. The city council and Mayor Dickens are a kind of mafia working on behalf of corporations, contractors, land developers, and they wear MLK's legacy like a mask to try to hide their naked corruption.
But let's back up and get a lay of the land here. How did we wind up in this mess where we have record homelessness in the first place? To answer that, we really need to make sure everyone is on the same page about what happened in 2008 and how the rebuilding of the economy after the so-called Great Recession has come with a lot of negative side effects. The last time we had a really serious housing crisis like we've had over the past 15 years was during the Great Depression. At the height of the Great Depression in 1933, more than half of all mortgage debt was in default and homelessness soared as a result. The federal government started putting into place some policies during the New Deal era which were supposed to prevent there from ever being such a serious housing crisis again. They started by creating the Federal Housing Authority to help with construction, maintenance, and rehabilitation of residential properties with the goal of trying to get out ahead of future problems in the housing market by building plenty of housing and keeping what we already have laying around in good shape. This was a good start, but it did hit a bit of a snag early on. The program was helping to get homes built, but there wasn't really enough cash in the banks to give people the mortgages to buy all the homes that the FHA was capable of building. At that point, there were no mortgage bonds or anything like that. If you got a mortgage, you probably got it through a local bank or credit union, and you paid the whole thing back to that bank. Each bank only has so much in deposits to use to write more mortgages, and the government needed a way to get those mortgages off of lenders' hands to make sure they always had enough cash to write as many mortgages for qualified applicants as they had applications, instead of being constrained by their deposits. So the federal government created Fannie Mae, a government-backed company whose job is just to buy mortgages from banks and lenders and to hold them so that the banks and lenders can go back out and lend to more new homeowners. Lending standards were vigorous at the time, so there really wasn't a lot of risk. All Fannie had to do was sit back and collect the mortgage payments until they were paid off, and sell pieces of that business to other investors like pension funds as a safe haven investment. But Fannie had one big limitation. They could only buy mortgages that came through the FHA, the Veterans Administration, or the Farmers Home Administration. So in 1970, they opened things up further by creating Freddie Mac, a sibling company to Fannie which was permitted to buy whatever mortgages were on the market. And for a time, that strategy of building homes and buying mortgages from lenders to free up funds was driving up home ownership and keeping homelessness low. But by about the 90s, we had really reached a fork in the road in the way that we deal with housing. More money for loans meant housing prices rose unchecked for decades and created this mentality that homeowners have today that we take for granted, but we really should not. That is, the idea that your home is an asset like a stock that's guaranteed to go up dramatically in value if you hold it for long enough. Not just that it should go up a bit, enough to beat inflation so that it has the same relative value so you at least break even when you want to sell later. I'm specifically talking about the mindset that increases in housing prices should be similar to stocks or Bitcoin or other types of riskier investments. This mentality has a couple of serious problems. One is that homeowners often gauge where they're at financially based on how much equity they have in their home at its current price. For instance, a lot of people borrowed against their homes in the mid-2000s during the peak of the last housing bubble, thinking that housing prices can only go up, so any equity is just free money I can borrow from my future self, not something I'm taking a real risk on. This winds up being a self-reinforcing logic, as people taking out their equity and spending it temporarily inflates the economy, and justifies to everyone that they were correct to be so bullish about the housing market. But at a certain point, house prices have to level off, and the more debt homeowners have built up against the value of their homes while that bubble was growing, the more exposed they are even to just a leveling off of prices, let alone a crash. The same thing applies to house prices and what people are willing to take on as debt. When the market has been surging for years, why wouldn't you be aggressive about trying to get the most house you can possibly get today, even if it's such a big chunk of your monthly income that you might have a hard time making the mortgage payment? If home prices moved in line with inflation, I would have no reason to be aggressive, because the change in value wouldn't be that big of a deal. But when you're talking about a doubling of house prices over a period of 10 years or so, the difference in free money you accrue as equity if you buy a $250,000 house versus a $500,000 house is a lot. 10 years in, you would have paid about $83,000 for the first house and $167,000 on the second. But you'd have over $500,000 in equity on the second house, while only about $350,000 in equity on the first. You see how much incentive there is to be aggressive when things are set up like this? When so much of the decision making by homeowners and lenders and banks is based on this rose-tinted view of the world that prices can only go up, a leveling off is always going to cause a panic and a crash, and that's exactly what happened in 2008. I would encourage everyone to check out something informative about the 2008 financial crisis. There's a bunch of really good documentaries about it, or for something more fun you could check out Too Big to Fail and The Big Short. I'd encourage watching them both if you're going to go that route, because they tell two key sides to the story when you put them together. The Big Short is all about the fundamentals of the housing crisis and how the mortgage bond industry became so toxic, but it does kind of assume that you know all the political drama that went down in Washington and on Wall Street in 2008. Too Big to Fail, on the other hand, shows what was happening at the Treasury Department, the Fed, and the banks in 2008, and is basically everything The Big Short assumes that you would know. But I don't want to get too lost in this topic here, because I could talk about the global financial crisis all day. But this brings me to the second serious issue with the investor mentality around housing. It's attracted a lot of investors, not homeowners who see their home getting more valuable as a perk to home ownership, but people just looking to buy up homes and resell them at a huge profit or rent them out for way above what it costs them. These days, they even run scams on unsuspecting rental applicants, collecting the application fees from desperate would-be renters without approving anyone, letting the unit sit empty while collecting more in application fees every month than they would have made charging rent. This predatory mindset was a huge part of what caused the 2008 crash, because of the mutually beneficial exploitative relationship that lenders and house flippers had. Banks make their money on mortgages through fees. They buy lots of mortgages from lenders, they bundle them into bonds, and they make huge fees on those bonds when they sell them to investors, which separates them from the risk of whatever they've created. So the big banks didn't really care who small banks and mortgage lenders were approving for a mortgage in the early 2000s. They assumed that prices would never go down, and that if they had to foreclose on anyone, those homes could be resold at a profit anyway. This was perfect for the house flippers and landlords who were maxing out their credit to buy up properties to flip. They didn't even have to work very hard to defraud the lenders who would write a mortgage for anyone with a pulse. This double-blind feedback loop is really the ultimate source of the housing crash in 2008. I don't think the flippers had a broad enough view of the economy to understand why the banks had let them off the leash or how it could snowball into such a massive global problem. But the banks absolutely could have looked under the hood and seen how much fraud they were helping to perpetuate, and how a lot of real estate activity by the mid-2000s was just flippers swapping overpriced houses with one another. But as we know, when prices leveled off, everyone had a Wile E. Coyote moment where they ran off the cliff, but gravity didn't kick in until they looked down. The bottom fell out and foreclosures soared, wiping out normal families who had been prudent with their money and reckless gamblers alike. And at that point, the original goals of the Federal Housing Authority, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the rest of the government's housing programs got turned upside down. The wave of foreclosures caused landlords, banks, and private equity companies to start vacuuming up as many homes as they could while home prices had fallen off a cliff. I see variations of the same meme all the time that say something to the effect of, "Silly me for being in 10th grade in 2010 when I should have been buying a house for the price of an Egg McMuffin," or something like that. And you may know one or two people who were already of working age when the crash happened and managed to get a mortgage while credit was still pretty frozen but home prices were still pretty low. But those cases, real people getting houses for crazy cheap by our standards now, are the exception rather than the rule. It was big financial institutions and professional landlords who gobbled up most of that discounted housing. They were helped out a lot in this by the fact that the government didn't seem worried about who wound up with the houses at all. Their only concern was getting prices to rise for housing as well as in the stock market. The Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to effectively zero for about a decade, turning on a fire hose of no-interest loans for banks to use to blow a new bubble to save the economy from the last one. And blow they did. As a result, many of the 50-plus year trends in housing data have been broken over the last 10 or 15 years. Home ownership is declining, homelessness is rising, and multi-generational family living is becoming much more common again. Home prices have soared, blowing away all the mid-2000s records at this point. If it wasn't bad enough in the 2010s, since COVID, things have gone even further into overdrive, again egged on by the Fed, who pumped trillions of dollars to keep this game of hot potato going. Average home prices were already above their 2006 and 2007 highs before COVID, and they're up another 20% or so since COVID. And in 2023, homelessness in the US reached its record high, surpassing its previous high water mark of 2007, and only continues to grow. So this is the context for the crackdowns the city of Atlanta has been doing against homeless folks for years. Banks, landlords, flippers, speculators, and the government made a big bubble that popped in everyone's faces and destroyed trillions of dollars of wealth. And then rather than bail out the people whose lives have been ruined by a key part of our life being turned into a roulette game, the government bailed out the bankers and scammers who should all still be in prison for fraud. And not only bailed them out, but turned on a spigot of cheap credit to help them scalp everyone else's assets off the auction block, leading to the totally unaffordable housing we have now and the permanent state of deterioration that our country is now in. And it is not just Atlanta. Around the country, state and local governments are passing aggressive laws that make it illegal to be homeless basically anywhere. Florida banned all public camping in sites that aren't certified by the State Board of Parks. But the State Board of Parks doesn't appear to be accepting any applications. Kentucky even passed a law allowing property owners to use lethal force on people camping on their property. There's a lot of hand-wringing about the problems of these kinds of camps springing up, like the health and sanitation and safety of the people there, as well as in the neighborhood around. But the people who have passed these laws and ordered these sweeps can hardly contain their disdain for the homeless when talking about it. Anti-camping bans and police sweeps of encampments is about removing an eyesore for people who aren't actually worried about the realities that other human beings are facing. They're just worried about having to see it themselves, or even worse, that the people with money might have to see them. And that leads me back to Andre Dickens and the city council. The housing policy of the current mayor and council has been to bait and switch Atlantans with promises of affordable housing development that the developers can then later go back on with little to no consequence. If you search the web for affordable housing Atlanta, you're likely to find a lot of articles from local media talking about Mayor Dickens' latest groundbreaking on a housing development that the city is helping to finance or fast-tracked approval for. If you read the fine print, you'll notice that most of these developments aren't even close to being all affordable housing. It's usually a set number of units that the developer is setting aside and supposedly promising to keep affordable. That has two really big problems baked into it. One is that the definition of affordable is slippery to say the least. In a lot of the terms that I looked at, the definition of affordable isn't connected at all to the real wages of applicants or inflation-adjusted purchasing power or anything that would actually consider whether or not the people who need the housing could afford to rent this house or this apartment long term. When they say affordable, they literally just mean reserved for renters making below the average income of this area, by some arbitrary distance that means nothing and doesn't actually make the housing affordable. As we established earlier, the housing market right now is based on crazy speculation and constantly rising prices. If you own your home, or for whatever reason might not have shopped for a home or apartment in a while, do me a favor. Pause this and just go on Zillow or one of the other big listing sites and just peruse for a bit, and then come back and talk to me. The longer it's been since you've had to rent, the more these prices probably make your eyes water. The smallest, dingiest hovels are renting for over $1,000, and anything that looks remotely like somewhere you would like to live is now going for $2,000 minimum. How can we possibly be tethering our definition of affordability to this runaway bubble? And it's self-reinforcing to use the local median income as our benchmark, when a high cost of housing guarantees a high income population, which skews your local median upward and means the benefits of affordable housing discounts wind up going to people who don't need it the most. If I use 80% of the median local income as my threshold, in a place where the local median income is significantly higher than the state median income, as most, if not all of Atlanta is, most of these affordable units go to people right at about 79% of the average. Barely poor enough to qualify for the discount. We're talking upper 5-digit incomes here, so not exactly poor, but doing okay enough to afford the high rent even after getting the discount. It's a bad sign if the resources we have for affordable housing are being used to give people making $50,000 a cooler place to live, rather than to give people making $25,000 a place that they can actually afford to live at all.
Rolling? All right. The second problem is the bait and switch. These deals all appear to be structured so that the property managers and developers who build with the promise of 20% affordable units or whatever can just go back on that later, paying a fine that is nowhere near high enough to deter any of these companies. Let me give you an example. If you've ever been to Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, particularly in the early years like 2017 to 2020, you might have tailgated at the Gulch. This is the Gulch. I tailgated for a lot of Atlanta United games while I was living here. Well, in 2018, the LA-based developer CIM Group made a deal with the city for multiple housing developments, with the promise of 20% affordable units in all of their complexes, including a 304-unit development at the Gulch right in the middle of downtown. Obviously, this is pretty primo real estate, so right away we should question whether or not affordable could really even be possible here in an area where we know the market rent is likely to be extremely high. 60 units at the Gulch development and 200 units in the city in total were supposed to be reserved as affordable units, which they define as being priced for households making less than $50,000 a year for
99 years.
The deal that the city cut CIM Group in exchange for their promises of affordable housing was, frankly, mind-boggling. The city is allowing the developer to keep the state and local sales taxes from businesses within the footprint of the development. And as a mixed-use development, there's going to be a bunch of retail built in, and that's millions of dollars handed right back to the developer from the city. It essentially makes them a part of the city government. And they get a $20 million a year tax holiday for the entire project, all in addition to the $1.9 billion in subsidies paid for the construction project. I could say that economists have criticized this deal, saying that it's a much larger incentive package than could possibly pay off for the city.
Because they have.
But do you really need an economist to tell you that if the city has to pay nearly half the cost of a development up front and give decades worth of freebies just to get someone to move in, that it's probably not really worth it at that point? I'm saying this really loud. They could probably hear me. The city would have been a lot better off hiring the architects and contractors themselves and using the $2 billion plus of the taxpayers' money to develop public housing. But public housing and affordable housing aren't what they're after. The developers are a cash cow for the mayor and most of the city council. Real estate donations make up about a third of the total donations to the city government. This is a recipe for the exact type of backtracking we've seen on affordable housing promises from grifters like CIM. Mayors and council members come and go, and a lot of the deals they make involving contractors don't come to fruition until after the mayor who signed it has already left office. Which means the real incentive for our elected officials isn't to build affordable housing at all. It's to make deals with developers that claim a bit of affordable housing is going to be built, but also making those deals super easy to slide out of, for pocket change relative to what the developer will make through subsidies and tax breaks. Most of the people you see smiling in those groundbreaking photos from various developments around town know that the property manager is gonna back out later in most cases. Yet local news uncritically regurgitates whatever the mayor, the council, and the developers say regardless. Let's tear open some of the numbers at play here so I can show you why this whole idea of having lower priced housing jammed in alongside market rate and luxury housing does not work without legal enforcement. CIM Group said that they would set aside 60 units of the Gulch development, which is called Centennial Yards, for 99 years at prices tailored for families making less than $50,000 a year. Centennial Yards, which officially opens later this year, has studio apartments at an absolutely ludicrous 420 square feet for $1,395 a month, one-bedroom apartments for around $1,400 up to nearly $2,000 a month, and two-bedroom apartments for about $2,500 a month. Let's take 20 of each of those types of units to give us 60 units in total, which is how many they said they were going to make for affordable housing, and let's see how much those would make every year. About $1.34 million every year, just off those units, not the whole development. We don't know what the actual mix of the 60 units made available was under the original deal, but I can't find any evidence of them changing the layout of the building or anything major like that before dropping the affordable housing part of the plan. So it's likely that the initial deal was supposed to be that they were going to let 60 apartments go for a lower price than what they would be charging for the exact same apartment next door. That's another huge red flag that the intent to pull out of this deal was there from day one. If they really thought they were going to follow through on charging some percentage less on those 60 units, then they would have built the building with 60 units that were smaller and had cheaper appliances and fixtures than the other 244 units. And I know this because in places like New York, where some private developers who were given subsidies in exchange for units of affordable housing, but had those terms made ironclad for them, did exactly that. Some of them even had separate entrances for the wings with the affordable units, which is pretty gross. But it does drive home my point that if they're going to build a luxury apartment unit and an affordable apartment unit, they're going to build them separately. There is simply no chance that they were going to put the same refrigerator in a unit price for luxury lessees that they were going to put in the lower price units, and multiply that across every fixture and amenity right down to the choice of paint. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with how a business works. They base their prices off of their costs, meaning when they want higher prices, they shoot for higher costs, like nicer, more expensive features. And when they want or need lower prices, they try to economize. Sometimes that means cutting out quality and features and the extra expenses that come with them. So in all these deals that the city has done involving subsidies and tax breaks for development, the first place you should sniff to conduct your smell test is to look at the division of units. If they're building out separate spaces at a lower cost, then they might actually have some intention of charging a lower rent for a while. But if they're telling you they're just going to discount the normal units out of the goodness of their hearts, there's a diaper you need to change. So how much do these 60 units make in the time that CIM promised to rent control them for? 99 years. About $132 million. They paid an $8.5 million in lieu fee for backing out of the affordable housing part of the plan, which is about 6% of what those apartments would make over 99 years at current rent prices. But if you're familiar with rent, you probably know that rent prices are not fixed and can rise constantly for decades at a time. For comparison, 100 years ago, the average home price was around $6,000. And the average home price as of the third quarter of 2024 was $420,000, a 70 times increase in the price over 100 years. If Centennial Square was to increase rents 70-fold over those 99 years, the 60 units that were supposed to be affordable would be capable of pulling in $92 million a year by the year 2125. Would you be deterred by an $8.5 million fee over apartments that you could easily make back in 5 years' time by breaking contract and charging the market price? It's shockingly disproportionate when you get down to it, to a degree that it can't wholly be by accident. No one in the city government could possibly have believed that this fine would be a sufficient deterrent. And I cannot stress this enough that 4 out of every $10 spent on this development were provided by the city and state, around $2 billion in total for businesses that will be raking in hundreds of millions of dollars in profit in the long term from this project. All to add 0 units of affordable housing to the city of Atlanta and actively drive up property values downtown, making the affordability crisis even worse.
I bet it feels like I've lost the plot here. Weren't we talking about homelessness? Yes, but you need to understand how lucrative property development in Atlanta is right now in order to understand why the city would commit such a blatant act of terrorism to hold up property values. The people living in encampments around the city wouldn't have been able to afford the affordable units at Centennial Square or at any of the city's other bait-and-switch affordable housing projects. But I think $2 billion could have gone quite a long way into putting them into housing of some sort. And to the city's credit, they have put some money into housing for the homeless specifically, building some small apartment complexes with fully furnished units. 23 of those apartments were made available at the end of 2024, with more expected to come soon. Which just makes this so much more infuriating. They know how to build and manage housing. The problem is, if that's how they chose to approach things every time, then the city wouldn't get to deal with the people they are being paid to deal with. Mayor Dickens and his predecessors like Keisha Lance Bottoms and Kazim Reed have, as far as I can tell, gotten into politics for the same reasons that most American politicians get into politics. It's an easy way for personable, social people to turn their connections and smooth demeanor into a luxurious lifestyle of corruption, being swooned by the rich and powerful, and having themselves and their families lavished with gifts and jobs for as long as they can keep the favor train running. If they had decided to use the $2 billion they had burning a hole in their pocket to build real, affordable public housing, they could probably have put most of the city's homeless population in housing overnight. But what chances to be swooned would that have opened up? If you do it right, none. You make contractors compete for the project, or you expand the Department of Public Works so that they can play a bigger role in construction. And then you turn it over to the housing authority when it's done. This is that conflict between homes as a place to live and homes as an investment opportunity brought to its logical conclusion. The investor class will make it unaffordable to have shelter if they're not dealt with. We have more than enough homes to house every family, and more empty homes than homeless people even. We don't have a shortage of housing or a lack of resources for developing more housing, or even a lack of public funds for public housing. The city and the state had $2 billion laying around for the CIM deal after all. Our single solitary problem in housing in this country is that so much of it is owned by an idle class of predators gouging us for one of the most crucial things in our lives. And if it's not bad enough for these parasites to take half or more of our income every month, they're using the money they steal from us to turn around and buy off our representatives and use them as marionettes to make the housing market even more hostile and thus more profitable for them than it already is. And it should be clear by now what those parasites are willing to do to protect their investment. Let's clarify exactly what happened here so that we're all on the same page. And content warning, there's some violent descriptions coming. On January 16th, the morning the city came to remove people from the encampment on Old Wheat Street, the folks present were given 4 minutes to gather their belongings and leave before the Department of Public Works crews began clearing the site with heavy equipment. They did not check the tents individually before they started doing this, putting anyone still in the camp at extreme risk. 49-year-old Cornelius Taylor was still asleep in his tent when he was run over, crushing his pelvis and lacerating his spleen and liver. Witnesses on the scene say they tried to alert the crew and the police to the fact that Taylor was still in his tent, but they were ignored. Taylor was able to crawl from his tent and flag down a nearby cop, Sergeant Jonathan Allen of APD. who we already have to be suspicious of, considering Allen was on the scene when the thorough check of the tents should have been conducted before using bulldozers and other heavy machinery. We don't know the identities of every cop on the scene, and we won't until the final report is released, which could be weeks or months. But Allen's rank as sergeant makes it more likely that he was the one in a position of authority here. Allen attempted to speak to Taylor and called an ambulance. Sergeant Allen claims that Taylor was bleeding from the nose and producing a foam from his mouth, but, quote, showed no signs of physical hurt. And this is crucial because a lot of the media coverage at this point moved on from the extremely disturbing initial police report, which hints at an attempted cover-up. The report goes on to suggest drug use or an overdose as the reason for having to call the ambulance. Both Taylor's family and witnesses say there was a considerable amount of blood in and around his tent that clearly couldn't have all come from the nose, and we really have to ask how or why APD could get this so wrong. The most innocent answer is that this so-called first responder, a veteran of the force of 15 years, couldn't tell that a person had had their torso crushed and flippantly assumed it to be drugs, which does not reflect well on Sergeant Allen, his subordinates, or the Atlanta Police Department. If that's the level of attention to detail that we're working with, even among senior officers, I don't see APD being a very effective crime-solving force. But I think we have to consider the more evil scenario. Allen called the ambulance to take Taylor to Grady and hoped no next of kin could be found. Imagine for a second that Taylor's family had not been reached. The initial police report filed by a ranking officer would have read that Cornelius Taylor was taken to Grady for a drug overdose and died there. There would have still been a medical examiner's report and an autopsy, but without the family and their lawyers in play, the only other people who would have known what happened would have been the Department of Public Works crew, the APD units on the site, and the homeless folks there who the government and media could have easily ignored. If the Atlanta Police Department had wanted to see if they could make Cornelius Taylor disappear after they killed him, the first step they would have taken would have been to file a report claiming that he died of an overdose. This is either a staggering wave of incompetence that should lead to a wave of firings all the way up to the police chief at the Atlanta Police Department, or this is an attempted cover-up. And for legal reasons, I'll let you mull over which of these you think is the more likely scenario.
I saved the Supreme Court ruling on this issue for last because I think it takes us right into the call to action. The court ruled last year that bans on public camping and, in effect, homelessness don't violate the cruel and unusual provision of the Constitution, of the 8th Amendment specifically. And in the wake of that ruling, most of the commentary that I saw was laying into the court for how inhumane the decision is. And while I do disagree with the outcome of the ruling, I think we have to understand that the problem here is the current provisions of the U.S. Constitution and not the current court's interpretation of those provisions. The 8th Amendment says you can't receive cruel or unusual punishment for committing a crime. Well-intended folks have argued in the past that arresting someone for being homeless is cruel and unusual, and it is firmly unconstitutional to arrest someone for any kind of status. The best example of that is that you can be arrested for public drunkenness or DUI, but you cannot be arrested for being an alcoholic. The problem with this case, which came from Grants Pass, Oregon, is that the crime isn't being homeless, it's the public camping thing. And the thing that really makes this court case a precedent more than anything else in my view is that it throws out a 2018 case where the Supreme Court ruled that a local government couldn't enforce a camping ban on public grounds if the local shelter was full. The newest court ruling just focuses on the rule of judges, the local judges in Oregon who have to rule on the camping ban, and the appellate judges who have to rule on the appeals. The law is the law, and legislatures need to change or create new laws to deal with problems. Having judges just pick and choose laws based on vibes is really not an ideal system. And this is important because while I do think the court's majority in this decision is doing a kind of stop hitting yourself routine, the court's minority, who claim to be speaking for the homeless, are doing themselves a disservice by idealizing the Constitution to a degree where they almost can't tell the difference between what it says and what they would like for it to say. Cruel and unusual punishment is a matter of how people are arrested, held, tried, and sentenced. You cannot have cruel and unusual application of the law. It doesn't even make any sense. You could have discriminatory application of the law, and laws can be found unconstitutional, but the act of applying the law itself cannot be cruel and unusual. If the law doesn't say what you want it to say, then you need to change what the law says, not cling on to a flattering at best constitutional argument and just hope to keep beating the appeals in court. If you want to protect the homeless, you need laws that protect the homeless, explicitly and in no uncertain terms, and policies to get them into housing. You don't need a squirrely interpretation of one of the amendments and a rabbit's foot to rub on while the Supreme Court mulls it over, but that's been the liberal approach to most things in politics for at least the last 50 years. So that's what I want y'all to do. To start figuring out what kind of local housing justice groups you can build, connect with others working in your area on housing struggles already, and fight to change some of these laws. Designate places where unhoused people can camp and be protected. Coordinate with local food banks and medical charities to deliver aid to those camps. Create and/or fund a local housing authority and do everything you can to build housing that's made to cost what real people can actually afford with their real wages. Set ordinances blocking landlords and short-term rental hoarders from cornering the local housing market and try to stabilize local property values. We have to get off this train of housing inflation before it completely breaks our economy, whether the investors like it or not. And sure as you're born, they will not. A lot of the data about housing prices is signaling that we could be at the peak of another bubble and due for another crash imminently. One housing price index, the Schiller Index, tracks home prices relative to the cost of construction, and that metric is more out of whack now than it has been at any point in history along with the 2008 crash. I don't want to speculate on how much longer that bubble can expand. I have been early, if not wrong, for a really long time on this issue, but it is without question a bubble, and one day it will blow. When that happens, we need to learn from past mistakes, and when the next one pops, we need to stabilize prices at affordable levels and keep them there, rather than pump up another doomed bubble. But our current crop of politicians are so intoxicated off the wealth of that bubble that they can't even perceive of making these kinds of changes. To them, there is no problem other than the camps. The average home price isn't a problem for them. It's not an obstacle to owning a home or renting or anything like that. It is like it is for the rest of us. Rising prices is just more wealth for them. They only see a problem in the blight that a housing bubble creates. As long as we're governed by people who align with investors and speculators rather than with the people, we're governed by people whose goal will never be to eliminate homelessness, but rather to exterminate the homeless. Andre Dickens has spelled out the city of Atlanta's intention to provide his final solution to homelessness. Deal with him and the city council accordingly.
This has been a presentation of New Ellijay Television. Visit us online at newellijay.tv.